Okay, let me go. All right, does everyone see my screen or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You guys are seeing the understanding of the contingent for sale buyer's property, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Awesome. All right, well, let's go ahead and dive deep into this. Again, this is Simon Cazares, broker for KW South Bay, team leader for South Bay, and also the coastal properties as well. So thanks again for jumping on today's call. We're going to dive deep into the understanding of the contingency for sale buyer's property. So what is this form, right? Well, the contingency of sale, better known as the COP, is an essential part of our association's ZIP forms, right? It protects both the buyer and the seller when the purchase depends on the sale of the buyer's current home. So the COP is when they need to utilize the proceeds of their current property, right? So let's say they're hosting, driving around and going on open houses. Hi. Yeah.
Last night, and I think I that.
Little bag. You may want to check up on the front. Did you check up in the front? Okay, yeah, check up with the front. I didn't see any bag in here. Yeah, sure, no problem. So it all really depends on the avenue and how, when the buyer is, let's say, driving around and then happens to go to an open house and falls in love with the home, right? And they love it, that they want to make an offer on the property, right? But it's contingent that they have to sell their property in order to pull the proceeds for a substantial down payment on their next home, because they cannot sustain two mortgages, right? Their current or their future home, right? And it really depends. They may be in a position where they may just rent the place, right? And not necessarily need the proceeds of it, but it still would be a contingent that they have to find a tenant in place in order for them to make that transition. So this particular form goes into the comprehensive breakdown of the sections of the form and how to navigate this, because it can be a very delicate dance, if you want to say, because there's a lot of moving parts, right? You got the buyer who is buying a property, but you also have a buyer who's selling a property and a buyer that's buying their property, right? And there's conditions there. And we're in the mercy of that buyer to perform, because if that deal doesn't go through and it falls apart, then it disrupts also their purchase. And it can be what's called a chain train transaction chaos. So this form puts perspective and puts clarity in how to navigate the process. What makes a transaction contingent, right? Well, the COP creates a protective framework when buyers need to sell their existing property. Complete a new purchase. The contingency defines the clear timeframes, establishes communications, protocols, and outlines the specific rights for both parties through the transaction, right? Because again, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of conversations in between, and it's contingent that they have to sell their property in order for them to succeed, to pull the proceeds and ultimately concurrently buy their second home. So the understanding of the contingency is very crucial for managing the expectations, minimizing delays, and protecting your clients from potential complications. Now, with that being said, there's going to be delays. I remember one of our agents had a similar dilemma. She was the listing agent selling their home, and she also got her clients a property and got their offer accepted on their purchase. And we were in the mercy, unfortunately, we were in the mercy of them trying to sell their home. And there was a lot of issues and delays with that buyer trying to buy the property. We kept asking for extensions because, again, they needed the money in order to carry it over to their new purchase. But because that property wasn't selling, we had to consistently be asking for extensions. Well, at this point, the up leg, they're getting frustrated. It's like, what's the delay? What is happening? Why are you taking so long? Because your typical transaction should be anywhere from 25 to 35 days, typically. 35 to 45 days typically is usually your escrow period. But when you have a contingent property, then it may delay, it may take longer because we're waiting for the buyer that's buying your client's property. So that can delay weeks and sometimes months. This is why we have this COP for that protection to be able to navigate it. The form ensures the transparency and accountability while providing the multiple exit strategies. So there's ways that you can, put parameters in place that if it doesn't go through, well, we don't have to drag for months and months and months. We have a stipulation that says, hey, you know what, if you can't perform, we're going to send you the notice to perform. And that if you cannot release this as part of your condition, then the seller has the right to cancel with you, right? But it also puts the bigger scheme of it is full transparency where you stand as a buyer. Yes, sir.
Maybe it's on the beginning, start 45 days to 60 days,
Absolutely. Yeah.
if you know the situation.
Yeah, that's why the COP does provide clarity on it if you think you're going to need more time to do so. And it's again all about communications at the end of the day, right? The end of the day is communications. So if we're both in a deal, right? Let's say you're the listing agent, I'm the buyer who represents the client that has the COP that is contingent that they have to sell their property. I'm going to be in dialogue with you on a consistent basis, but more so, I'm going to be in dialogue with the buyer agent who is buying my client's property. And let's say that I'm the listing agent on that. I need to because I need that deal to close in order for me to now pull the money and transfer it over to the current one, which I'm with you. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right, so the three contingency options, which basically illustrates where you stand, right? So option one is a full contingency. Buyer must both enter into a purchase contract and successfully close on their current property. This provides maximum protection, but extends timeline considerably. Option B is contract only. Buyer needs only to enter into a contract for their property sale. This accelerates the process, but carries more risk since their sale hasn't just yet closed. And then option C on the COP form, it's already in escrow. Buyer property is already under contract and in escrow. Buyer must provide the details and anticipation closing date to move forward. So these are the options that you're giving the listing agent, right? You're giving the listing agent a kind of a sense of a story, where you stand. Because I'm going to tell you, a lot of listing agents don't want a contingent offer like this, a COP, because it's uncertainty, right? Did you list the property correctly, right? Did you overprice the home where it's going to sit for days on market, right? That might not be a good thing for me as a listing agent because my goal and my responsibility and my fiduciary duties to my client is to sell this property. But I don't want to drag it either. This is the reason I have to know and understand where you stand. Okay. Because a COP is basically a full picture scope of opening up the hood and doing a diagnostic of the engine. That's all you're really doing. You're just telling the listing agent and the seller, hey, this is where we're at. Okay. I happen to come into your open house, right? And I fell in love. I'm going to make an offer, but I haven't even put my property on the market, right? And that can happen. And the listing agent and seller can accept it. Maybe they've been on market for a very long time. This is the only offer, and it's a gamble, but I'd rather take the gamble because I have a bona fide agreement that they at least are considering submitting an offer. And if it's an offer with the contingent, I'm going to put tight conditions on there to protect my client from this going on for months and months and months, because it's not going to do justice, right? Because now they're tying up a property that if another buyer that is not contingent, I'd rather go in that direction. Kevin.
give examples of those type of.
Well, the tight conditions would be is releasing this sooner than the 17 days, right? Meaning that instead of releasing this in 17 days, because the form itself says that we'll accept your offer as an example, right? But if we don't put certain conditions on there, what happens is if another offer comes in, right? If another offer comes in, while I accepted this one. So let's say that I accepted the COP with this particular buyer, but now another buyer comes in that does not have a COP or a condition that they need to sell their property. I can give the buyer, Kevin's client, the buyer, notification saying, hey, we received a non-contingent offer. Therefore, you must release this as a condition. Well, if Kevin's client has not been able to do so, he's not going to be able to perform. He's not going to jeopardize the client's deposit. So he may have to cancel. So that's one of the stipulations that you're holding out from a listing perspective is that if I can come with another offer that is not contingent, I'm going to give you the opportunity to decide if you want to continue or not, because the COP has two elements to it. Okay. One is, do I need to really sell my property in order to pull the funds, or do I have any other avenues that I have reserves where I can not have to worry about this? I can still buy the property because I qualify. I'm just using that because I don't want to have two mortgages. But let's just say that the client may be able to, sustain um, the two mortgages, right? Until the other one sells, then you don't have to be contingent. You may still be able to move forward. And I've seen situations where clients do maintain two mortgages until the other one closes, right? But they do this because it's a safe haven that says, look, I don't want to be in that position of the strain and stress of having two mortgages because I'm responsible until that property sells, or otherwise, if I decide to rent it out, right? But what we're doing here, when we submit the offer, there's a section on the grid that says that this is subject to us selling our current property. That's what it is. And these are some of the options that you as a buyer's agent are going to disclose. So when I get it from the offer perspective, when I see the offer, I'm going to see that the COP is attached to it. I'm going to look, is the option A, option B, or option C? If I see that it's option C, good, because you already have your property in escrow, good. So most likely you're 30 days out to sell this property. And if he's telling us 30 days and they already been in escrow 2 weeks, that means in the next 2 weeks, they're going to close. Those proceeds will eventually come to my new escrow, and it's a done deal, right? That's the anticipation. So when I see the COP that it's already in escrow, that tells me, okay, they've already gone through the motions. You don't want to put yourself in that volatile position. Also, when it comes to you submitting an offer that they haven't even put the property on the market, you got to need a flexible seller and a flexible listing agent that's willing to take on a contingent offer. Because again, we don't want to drag it for months and months and months, right? So by having tight conditions on there will ultimately put the pressure on the buyer that's buying your client's property in a position to get it done. So that way we can now close successfully. Because when you have this tied up, then you have your current deal with the upleg tied up too. And what if that seller is also on an offer they submitted? So it can be a very complicated transaction where your clients, who are the buyers, you're helping them sell their property, right? Okay. But you also have your escrow that you are representing the sellers on their purchase. And then that seller that you went into contract maybe as a buyer now buying another property out of state. That's like 4 transactions. There's a lot of moving parts to that. Very stressful because everyone is in the mercy of the first one to close, and then eventually close. Does that make sense? So this form, and then the other form that we'll touch on, will kind of give you that way of navigation, right? Now, the best way is always sell your home first, do a seller in possession for 30 days, and then start shopping for a home, or at least wait until that buyer releases any and all contingencies, then start looking for homes because it's just easier on yourself that you at least have that peace of mind that this deal is going to close in the next couple weeks instead of putting the pressure that you put yourself into because you didn't maybe didn't guide your client well. And I understand sometimes the pulse of a buyer that they find the property, they don't want to miss that opportunity, but they need to sell their home in order to use the large down payment in order to buy their second home. Does that make sense? Okay.
Chime in for a couple minutes?
Yeah, please.
You know, contingencies really are a transfer of risk, if you think about it. It's when you're depending on which client, let's say you are representing the buyer and your buyer now wants to write up contingent, wants to make a purchase contingent on the sale of their existing property. When so doing, virtually what you are doing representing them is saying, don't worry, Mr. Homeowner, who's now my buyer who wants to buy this. We're gonna write this offer up contingent, transferring the risk to the seller. That if in the event you can't sell your own home, you're not going to be liable to purchase that outlay and or even be liable for losing your deposit. But when you're the listing agent on that now, receiving that contingent offer, it is now your client who is now the recipient of the risk. Okay, this is how you, as a listing agent, have to analyze, okay, the advice you give your seller, whether or not it is a good thing or a bad thing for them to consider accepting an offer that is contingent on the sale of an existing property. And so the number one thing when you're a listing agent to advise your seller to consider a contingent offer is understanding the marketplace that you are in. If we are in a marketplace where as an example, when rates are at 4% and every friggin' listing had 20 offers on it, why in the world would you want to end up putting your seller in a position or having the seller accept a contingent offer? But conversely, at that point, if rates here are at 8% and the house has been on the market for the last 90 days without a single offer, and this is the one and only offer that has marched through the door, okay, but still contingent, okay, it's like, yeah, we're willing to play ball. And yet it's also then understanding the balance. This is our jobs as the agent, the balance of analysis to be able to say, well, can we have almost the best of both worlds? Referring to accepting an offer that's contingent because, well, you know, we've been on the market for 2 weeks, haven't got it, but we've had showings, but no offers. All right, maybe we can consider it and then maybe responding back of giving a first right of first refusal in case a new offer did march through the door. Okay. But the whole understanding is then communicating with your clients and is paramount. So that if you end up putting the house on the market now after the contingent offer took place, okay, Mr. Seller, this is now the time that we need to price your property effectively, not shooting for the fences of going way overboard, you know, because you still have a timeline here on the contingent offer of the house you want to purchase. So there could be a whole class on that in itself.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. Yes,
You mentioned 17 days. What's that, the number? Why you?
that's gonna be the next it's the next slide here. So the timeline required MLS listing obligations, right? The contract enter period, right? Typically it's 17 days from acceptance from a buyer to enter into contract for their property sale. So the COP has a condition similar to, you know, loan contingency, appraisal contingency, seller's disclosure. Well, this is also a position that the seller has a 17-day period. Buyers must deliver escrow information to seller and escrow holder within the specified date of the contract. MLS listing proof. Buyer must sign listing agreement and provide MLS proof within days acceptance demonstrating good faith marketing efforts, right? So let's say that it is a property that when they submit an offer is already in escrow, right? So you as a listing agent can put on the seller counter offer, hey, show me proof, give me the address, let me see where you're at. Because again, you want to make sure that you're delivering all of this information to your seller so the seller knows exactly where we stand, right? Because again, if the property is not on the market, well, we don't know what the buyer's intentions are. Are they going to put it at a price competitive where they're going to get multiple offers, or is it a property that's going to sit on the market for weeks and weeks and weeks and not get any offer? We're stuck because if they need the proceeds, we can't move until they sell their home. So this is where a listing agent has to be very savvy in navigating this negotiation period to make sure you understand where you stand and not to drag it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then ultimately it falls apart because they couldn't sell the property because it was overpriced, right? So there's many elements to it, and you can be as specific as you possibly want. Tell me the condition of the property, right? Because if it needs a lot of work and they are pricing it too high for the area, well, again, do you want to go in that direction? As a seller, I want to sell the property, but I don't want to also be hung up for weeks or even months. I'd rather find someone else or keep the property active until I do find someone that is not contingent. So there's pros and cons on this that you have to look at it from all perspective. Now on the flip side to this, let's just say you are the buyer with this, right? And you're also helping them sell their property. So the pressure's on you. Now, as I said earlier, I would not start showing property to my client until I know that this property is on the market, listed in escrow, and at least the buyers are in the position to release any and all contingencies. Okay. You can start doing your search and navigating because at least that peace of mind is if the buyer falls out of escrow, right? And they've released all contingencies, well, there may be a chance for some monetary damage, a breach of contract, fail to perform, and the seller, the buyer may have some recourse to some of the deposit, and now can use that as a negotiation tool to extend on the current uplay, right? And says, look, in good faith, this deal fell apart. We were going to need an additional 2 to 3 more weeks so we can get this property back on the market. But in good faith to give you that extension, we were able to get some damage from the deposit. We will do, some type of term to release some of the money in good faith to give us that extra. So you can kind of work it in that parameter in place. Close up escrow deadline, final deadline for buyer property to close escrow, after which contingency can no longer be used to cancel. Now, remember, once that buyer releases the COP, that's a contingency that they cannot use, even though their property doesn't close, right? If it falls apart, you cannot come back. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to cancel because the buyer did not perform and we ended up canceling. If you release the COP, then you cannot use that as a avenue to cancel. The seller can still hold you accountable and says that's not a good reason. Unfortunately, you got to find another way of getting this done, or we may have some potential to go after some of your deposit. Okay. Communication status and update requirements, buyer's ongoing obligations. So the COP form requires the buyer to maintain transparency communication throughout the process. Buyer must proactively inform seller about any changes in their property sales status, including amendments to their purchase contract. So let's just say you did accept that buyer that is contingent, right? Well, that buyer's agent needs to be informing you on a regular basis if there's any changes. Fail to provide you with updates is also an opportunity to send a notice to perform because they're not following the procedures and the documentation that was agreed upon. So this is some of the conditions that must be done. Any changes, if they have done some changes, we as a listing agent need to know all of those parameters in place. So now we can inform our client where we stand. Because one little thing, folks, can delay the process for days or weeks. And that's vital and important, especially if we're trying to meet deadlines with rate locks and all that stuff, right? So it can be very sensitive and very volatile during this process. So when the seller makes a written request for updates, buyer typically have a specific number of days to respond with current status information to ensure the seller can make an informed decision of where their own transaction stands. Because I have another deal that I'm working on. I need to be in communications with them too, because it's contingent that I sell my property in order to qualify to buy that property. So communication from the back end, communication during your current escrow, and communication on the up leg as well is vital. So it can be very exhausting. It can be a little bit overwhelming. And I don't recommend it, but there's agents that do so because they're in that position. Now, we're hoping, right? We hope that all of the transactions go as smooth as possible. But the truth of the matter is you're going to have some hurdles, you're going to have some delays, and it's your job just to be able to navigate that. Does that make sense? So progress update, regular communications about the sales milestone and escrow progress, amendment notices, any immediate disclosure of any changes to the buyer's property, contract terms, cancellation must notify the seller within 2 days that the buyer's property is canceled. Okay, and that can happen. What if the back end property, the buyer doesn't perform and the seller needs to cancel? Well, they need to let us know immediately within 2 days that that has canceled, so we now know where we stand. Now, the problem gets even more complicated if the seller who your client is buying has submitted an offer on another property, right? And sometimes the agent who is representing the seller may be the agent representing them as a buyer, just as much as that buyer that submitted an offer on your listing. That buyer agent may be representing the buyer as a seller on that property, you know. But what if there's multiple agents, a buyer agent, a listing agent, and a new listing agent that is not involved with them? They're just using another agent to submit another offer, and that can happen. There can be up to 8 different agents involved in this whole transaction. That's a lot of communications, right? On top of escrows, on top of lenders too, right? You got to know how to navigate that, and it can be chaotic sometimes, folks. All right. Seller right to backup offer and performance demands. One of the most powerful protections for a seller on the COP is the ability to continue to market the property and accept backup offers even after entering into a contingent contract. This provision prevents the seller from being locked into an indefinite waiting period while the buyer works to sell their property, right? So in essence is just because you accept another offer, as I illustrated earlier with Kevin's situation, is we can still accept another offer. It's a condition, yes, but that condition you also have 17 days to perform. Now, there's also pros and cons on that, and you got to be very careful because there's savvy real estate agents that may ultimately put another checkbox that throughout the entire property, because this is a delay. So there's 3 elements to it, and I'll explain it in a little bit and how that works to when you receive a COP, because you got to look at it. And guess what? A lot of agents fail to do so, and then they kick themselves in the rear that they screwed up, did not see it, and now they put it where it's for the entire escrow period, right? That they cannot give us notice to release this as a condition. And there's a check box on the COP that says that, okay? So accept backup offer. Seller can continue to show the property and accept backup offers during the contingency period, right? Demand to perform. Seller can require buyer to remove this contingency or cancel within a specific time frame, right? That specific time frame is 17 days. Now you can modify it, right? If you're the listing agent, you can put a counter offer that says, no, 17 days is too much. We're gonna do 10 days, right? Or put those tight conditions on there. And if they don't perform, then you can cancel. Now, again, going back to my original conversation with all of you, what if this is the only offer? You've been on the market for 60 days, you don't have any other offers. You may be a little bit more lenient when it comes to this, not too aggressive, but you also want to set the tone and the standard that we're not going to drag our feet for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So this is how you need to know how to navigate this. And then issue notifications. Formal notice triggers countdown periods for buyer respond in actions, which again is the notice to perform. And that notice to perform is 48 hours after acceptance or after receipt, right? So if I send you an example, a notice to perform to release the COP, today would be 0 days, tomorrow would be 1 day, and then Sunday will be 2 days, right? But because it falls on a weekend or holiday, it reverts to the next calendar day, which in this case, you have till Monday at 11:59 p.m. to release this condition. And if you can't, the seller has the right to cancel. If you release it, great, we continue moving forward. Does that make sense? Okay. The notice to perform, what timelines aren't met? If a buyer fails to meet the agreed upon timelines or cannot perform adequately proof of progress on their property, the seller has the right to issue the notice to perform. This is critical. Critical document starts a countdown clock that requires the buyer to take specific action. The notice to perform typically gives the buyer a final opportunity to either remove the contingency, provide requirement documentation, or or process with cancellation. If the buyer does not respond appropriately before the notice period expires, the seller gains the right to cancel the entire purchase agreement and potentially retain the buyer's earnest deposit. Now it says potential, okay? It depends on the circumstances, right? Because you may be holding on to this particular condition, but you released all of the other ones, right? So it really, really, really depends on the circumstances, right? So let's say that you're in escrow and they fell out of escrow. Then they went back into escrow. Then they fell out of escrow again. Then they went back to escrow and then fell out of escrow again. That's 3 escrow cancellations, right? While you're still here waiting because we're still working with the same buyer, right? That's a long time, right? So it's vital and essential that the buyer's agent, if they're representing them as a seller on selling their home, that they put tight conditions too, because we're not going to wait. We're not going to prolong this. And immediately after this first cancellation, you may be in a position of questioning, do we continue with this particular buyer or not, right? It all depends. If I'm in communications with Steve, as an example, I know Steve is a solid real estate agent, professional. He's in constant communications with me. I might go the long stretch with him and says, let's do it. Let's just continue because he's been in communications with me throughout the process and he's been fully transparent with me as well and says, look, Simon, I hate to tell you, but we unfortunately had to cancel because that buyer didn't perform. We're fishing now. We're aggressively looking. We have a potential offer coming in. We just need that extra time. We're sending you the extension of time addendum to allow us to, one, the close of escrow, because we may not be able to close on the time we originally thought, but also to release contingencies, right? So in good faith, I'm going to relay this information to the seller. Says, look, the buyer's agent, Steve, reached out to me and says, hey, they fell out of escrow, but he has a good, strong offer coming in, and they should be able to get into escrow. They're going to put really tight conditions. And the beautiful thing is that this is a cash offer, so it eliminates a lot of red tape. The seller's ultimate decision is yay to it or no to it. If the seller says, yeah, let's go for it, we have no other offer, then I'm going to relay this information to Steve. Steve, we're solid, we can continue, right? And then that's how we kind of navigate this. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I do, although it's been a while since the last time, receive is, if I'm a listing agent and I receive an offer that's contingent on the sale of the property, of which they are already in escrow. You know, the COP also states, you know, the escrow number, you end up putting the escrow number in the COP that of your existing sale of that property. In the counter offer, I will say, you know, the seller will accept this contingency only on this escrow. So that if in the event that buyer falls out, okay, on the sale of that property, that it gives your seller the right to be able to say, hey, it fell out. You know, plain and simple, I now have the right to cancel on the basis of you no longer have an escrow with that escrow number, okay, with that buyer. And then on the same lines, based on the communication with the buyer's agent, how we are having, you know, if it is then communicated, hey, we immediately got a new buyer, okay, we will now consider doing an addendum now to our purchase contract, you know, allowing a new contingency in essence to take place, you know, but always know your position. If you're the listing agent, your allegiance and due diligence and fiduciary is to your client, you know, so, you know, pay attention on that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve, for sharing. All right, buyer cancellation and right of exit strategy. Before contingency removal, buyer retains the right to cancel the transaction if they cannot enter into contract or close escrow on their property within a specified time frame, but only if they haven't yet removed this as a condition. Remember, this is a wall that protects them, right? Once you release the COP, that's it, folks. You cannot use this as ammunition, even if they cancel and you release the COP, they cancel, and that can happen, right? Very end at the very end of the closing, the buyer gets cold feet, something happens, they cancel, you release this, you cannot use this, there may be monetary damage, okay? Protection, hold that thought. Protected cancellation window. The protection period allows buyer to exit without penalties if their property sale falls through or cannot be completed on the schedule. Once the contingency is formally removed, however, buyer loses that safe net, right? So once you release this, you're exposing your client's earnest deposit, because this is a protection that says to the seller, hey, I want to buy your property, but I cannot buy it until I sell my property. And once I sell it and it closes, I can now transfer the proceeds to the new escrow, and then I'm okay releasing this as part of the conditions, right? So you have to know how to navigate that, but also know that it's only a certain period of time. You could drag it until you end up closing on this one, right? But a good listing agent will probably not allow that, is, you know, because that it's uncertainty, right? So they may say, look, we'll give you up to a certain time frame, which is 17 days. And most times you can perform with 17 days, because I'm hoping that you're already in escrow on this one and you've been in escrow. So now you have a little bit more sense that you feel comfortable moving forward with the next purchase and releasing this as a part of the condition. What was your question?
Goes back to the first part. It says the buyers retain the right to cancel the transaction. What is the typical time frame that the buyer can exercise or use not to jeopardize the?
So this is one condition of many contingencies, right? Remember, as I said, this is your buyer's deposit, right? This is 30,000, 20,000, whatever the deposit that you both accepted, right? But you have layers of walls. Every time every time a buyer releases one of those walls, which is a contingency, it brings the seller closer and closer and closer to that deposit. As soon as you release all contingencies, that's basically all the walls, now the seller has the right to go after your earnest deposit. So in order to protect your buyer's deposit, you have what we call these walls or contingencies. And these contingencies, as a contingency of selling their property, contingency of loan, contingency of appraisal, physical inspections, buyer doing their due diligence. This is just one of others. So the buyer can, within their time frame, exercise the right to back out. Maybe they submit an offer, their offer gets accepted. They now went and did their physical inspections, and after looking at the condition of the property, they say, I don't like the property after all. I want to cancel. They're within their right under paragraph 14B to exercise that right to back out just because it looks like it's going to be too much work for them. That's your safe haven contingency period, right? Or you don't get the loan, or the appraised value doesn't come into what you submitted. You submitted an offer for $1 million and it comes down to 900. You're negotiating with the seller, right? The seller says, no, I'm not willing to go down to 900. I'm willing to go to 950, meet me in the middle. But the buyer says that means I have to come in with an additional 50,000. I just don't want to. So that may be an avenue for the buyer to back out. Okay. So it's not just this one. This one is a protection for the buyer. If they cannot perform and they cancel, they can then have the right to back out of the deal and use this as a condition to say, look, unfortunately, we tried, but that buyer didn't perform. I don't want to delay this. I want you to sell this property, so we're just out. And we can use this as part of your cancellation provision. Make sense? Kevin?
You have pretty much 17 days in your house, buyer has to put that up to escrow. But then that buyer, let's say they don't get it into escrow until the 15th day. Then their buyer has their 17-day contingency period, so the timelines are way off. So can this buyer remove that without their buyer removing their contingency?
Yeah, because remember, this contingent is that buyer submitting an offer to my listing, right? So I'm going to hold that buyer accountable to perform by releasing this as a condition, even though I know that that buyer has their contingencies in place. So the buyer and the buyer agent better be smart about it, right? Saying, look, I need to protect the client because if I release this and they don't release their contingencies or at least give us some indication that they will, I would not release the COP. I would ask for that extension of time to release the COP because I want to know if this buyer is going to perform, because this one ultimately is a big contingency for the buyer on my property. And if they cannot and they end up releasing the COP and this buyer doesn't release their inspection contingencies or appraisal or loan, whatever, then it compromises them. And I can say, well, that's not a good excuse for you to back out and cancel because you released this as a condition. So you told us that that is not a condition anymore. Does that make sense?
But the seller's got to decide whether they want to take that extension.
That's correct.
Right, and that's exactly it. The dialogue would be, understand that if you end up releasing and our buyer now on your house here backs out, you're now bearing the brunt of the potential loss of your deposit because you cannot now perform within the time frame that was set forth on that lake purchase.
Yep. Thank you. All right. So deposit timing and performance obligations. When do timelines actually start? A critical but often misunderstood aspect of the COP form involves when various performance timelines actually begin. Unlike standard purchase agreement where deadlines start immediately upon acceptance, contingency transactions have different trigger points. All time periods for inspection, contingency removals, and other contractual obligations don't begin until after the buyer provides proof of escrow on their property or formally removes the sale contingency in writing. This delays the start protects buyer from having to complete due diligence before knowing whether their own sale will proceed. Similar, the buyer's deposit is typically due in 3 days after providing escrow proof of removing the contingency, not immediately upon contract acceptance. The structure ensures buyers aren't financially at risk before their own transaction has meaningful momentum. So basically what this means is that the understanding is if you do accept a contingent offer, right? And they provide you with the COP. And I'm going to show you the actual form in a minute. So that way you understand what are the things you should be looking for to understand how to prepare the seller counteroffer, because you're going to put conditions on there, because you may miss something. And this is why I always say, look through all of the forms, right? Like when I go over an offer on the purchase agreement, I use two of my fingers and I do this. And I'd rather have the printed instead of going through the computer, because then I can highlight. I don't want to miss anything. So I'll go through it and see, okay, I see this highlighted. I see this highlighted. So that way, when I'm preparing my counter offer, I already know exactly how I'm going to prepare my seller counter offer to protect my client's best interest, right? Because we don't want to delay and drag it. Now, this is a condition that if it's accepted, it means that one, if the property is not in escrow, this is only if it's not in escrow, they don't necessarily have to do their due diligence with your property until they get their property in escrow first. And they have to give us notification. So you may say, okay, this is a gamble. This is too much of a risk. I'm not gonna, go in this direction. They haven't even put it on the property on the market. I don't even know what they're gonna list it for. I don't even know the condition of the home, right? You're gonna relay this information to the seller. The seller has to make the ultimate decision. You're just relaying the information. It's the seller's discretion that they want to perform with this particular buyer or not. Okay, they don't have to accept a contingent offer. They don't. And if this is the only offer, well, again, the seller doesn't have to accept a contingent offer. So again, just kind of understanding, but all of this starts the minute they open escrow. Now, when you receive the COP and it's already in escrow, they have to provide you with the escrow name and the escrow number. So that way now you can reference and says, okay, so this is solid. They're at least already in escrow. Then because they're in escrow, then it does start that they have to do their due diligence. They have to put in their earnest deposit and start doing their physical inspection, because it's a condition now. They were in escrow and they submitted an offer, so now they can start doing their performance. Okay. All right, and I think this is the last part of it. So the takeaways is balance protection. The CLP form creates a safeguard for both parties, allowing buyer time to sell while giving seller the ability to purchase backup offers and enforce timelines. Communication protocol, regular status updates and formal notification requirements ensures transparency and keep all parties informed throughout the contingency period. Clear timelines. Every deadline is explicitly stated from initial contract, entering in periods to final escrow, closing dates, eliminating ambiguous and misunderstanding. And then the exit strategy. Both buyer and seller have clearly defined paths to cancel if circumstances change, protecting everyone from prolonged uncertainty and financial risk. Mastering the COP enables you to confident guide clients through contingency transaction, minimizing delays and protecting their interests every step of the way. Okay, so let me do this now. Pardon me?
You're gonna email it?
Yeah, we can definitely send this to you. Not a problem. Let me. I thought I had my forms up, but it looks like I didn't have it up, so I apologize. Let me just show you real quick the COP. All right, so I'm going to pull it up now. Okay, so this is what the COP looks like, folks. Okay. So contingent of sale buyer's property, pretty self-explanatory. As soon as you click on the RPA that you're checking that it's
Simon, it's
contingent.
not showing on Zoom if
Okay,
you have the
thank you.
form up.
Thank you. 1 second, please.
There it is.
Okay, do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so this is the contingency of sale buyer's property. Pretty self-explanatory here. Just goes through all of the elements of the property date, buyer sellers, property address. And here it is, the buyer property is contingent. So ABC is buyer entering into a contract for sale of and closing escrow on buyer's property, only entering into contract for the sale buyer's property, only the close of escrow of buyer's property, which is already in escrow, right? So what we want to see when you receive this, we want to see this, because now it tells me that they're at least proactively engaged already, that the buyer who submitted an offer is already in escrow. Then they have to provide the escrow information here and the escrow name, number here, and when it's scheduled to close. Because that'll give me a temperature as saying, okay, it looks like they're going to close in 2 weeks. They made an offer for 30 days. So in 2 weeks from now, they close, the money will ultimately get into our escrow. We might even close sooner than 30 days. That might be the case. So that might be a win. It's when it's unchecked, right? If it's like this, then this is just basically saying it's a condition. We haven't even put the property on the market yet, right? That's a concern, right? So you got to know how to navigate this. Part two, buyer entering into contract for sale buyer's property, right? Buyer shall within 17 days, right? And you as a listing agent can also counter this. It defaults at 17, but also the buyer can put a different condition. They could say 25 or 23 days as an example, right? Oops, sorry about that. Here you go, right? But it's already default at at 17 days after acceptance. Okay, B, by the earlier of the specified 2 days after buyer enters into contract for sale of buyer's property shall deliver escrow evidence. So you can also modify this. Remember, the beautiful thing about negotiations is if you receive this, if they say 23 days, you can go back and say, no, 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 under the COP, sellers requesting that the buyer have it as 10 days or 17 days. And that also goes with providing evidence of going into escrow. They may say two days, or they may say 5 days, right? You may also counter that. All right. Section 3 goes into the listing and MLS status of the buyer's property, right? Buyer has signed a listing agreement with buyer's property within 3 days after acceptance, sign a listing agreement, and then it'll provide you who was the listing agent, right? It may be the agent that submitted the offer, or it may be someone else. Okay, it doesn't have to be the same agent. It may be ABC Realty and CBC Realty is the one submitting an offer, two different agencies, but they still have to provide it as transparency. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, close of escrow, section 4. It's basically saying that buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of the property and schedule close of escrow. If checked, no later than 5 days. Period to schedule close of escrow on seller's property once buyer's property closes. So basically, if they close, that means that, we should be closing within those 5 days as well, right? So let's say that they provided the COP, they made an offer of 30 days, right? And they close in 2 weeks, then the proceeds that we need in order to qualify is already concurrently now and wired to the current escrow, which is the escrow you're with. So what this stipulates is that within 5 days after the close of escrow, then we should be closing escrow on us. So it's not that whole 30 days, but only if they ask for an extension, right? Only if they ask that, what, I know it's within 5 days, but we still need a little bit more time, right? So it all depends on how you navigate this. Okay. The cancellation of buyer's property, if the buyer property is in or enters into escrow, and either party to that escrow gives the other notice of cancellation within 2 days. So remember, as I said earlier, if if the buyer's property doesn't close or gets canceled, they have to let us know within 2 days of that. So this can also be 3 days, 5 days, or 1 day, or you can even say 0 days here too. Okay, meaning as soon as you get cancellation, you tell us today. Okay.
Things or business days.
It's calendar days. Calendar days. Yes, sir. All right, backup offers. Okay, so this is where a little bit of people get somewhat confused, and I want to put some clarity on it because again, the presentation was one thing, but the actual form is another thing. So the backup offer, after accepted, seller has the right to continue to offer the property for sale. So it's basically you accept, you go active under contract, you have the ability to get another offer within this time. So if you get another offer that is not contingent, then you can now perform the notice to perform to the buyer's agent saying, hey, we received a offer that is not contingent. Therefore, we're giving you the notice to perform to release the COP. Most likely, they're not going to be able to do so. So we're unfortunately going to have to cancel, but then that gives you the opportunity to open up escrow with someone that is not contingent on that COP. Does that make sense? Okay. So, but it also has within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel, which is the 48 provision on the COP. Now, what you have to be very careful is the next section, section C. Time give notice to remove contingency. Seller shall have the right to invoke the notice provision in paragraph 7B, meaning I get an offer, I have the right to invoke that provision and say, hey, Mr. Buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we unfortunately received another offer, so we're asking you to release the COP. Well, wait a minute, we just opened escrow a week ago. We're still in the contingency period. I understand that, but we got a clean offer that is not contingent. You signed an agreement, you understood that we still have the right to continue to market this property as a ability that if we get another offer, we may accept. And you can start the negotiations, the back and forth, even though you're in escrow with this particular contingent buyer. And if you come to an agreement, you can accept this offer only, and then you're going to put a stipulation subject to cancellation, right? But you can negotiate with the second buyer until they release this as a condition. Because if they do release it, then you're basically stuck. That's why you put the contingency subject to cancellation. And if they perform, then unfortunately, that's your exit. Unfortunately, the buyer.
You
Unfortunately,
totally lost me, Simon.
okay. So because this is a COP, okay, and it already invokes the right that the seller can accept another offer, right? Another offer comes in, you're in escrow on this one, right? Offer comes in, you can negotiate while you're in escrow with this buyer and ultimately put a condition that says it's subject to cancellation of the current escrow. We can accept those terms, and let's say that the buyer accepts. The buyer now is kind of on a standby. Now we send the notice to perform to the current escrow who has the COP. We have a buyer who submitted an offer. We're in negotiations. We're asking you now to release this as part of your condition. So you have notice of 2 days to release the COP. If the buyer releases the COP, then unfortunately this is canceled and put as a backup offer until this buyer does not perform, and then we can put the new buyer in first position. But if the buyer who is contingent doesn't perform and doesn't release the contingency, then the seller has the right to cancel and then ultimately open escrow with the next buyer. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Yes.
So basically,
Thank you.
you disposition the first buyer because of that 2 days, it's, done. They release them, you ask them to release, so you can bring the second buyer while you're holding this one in your, like, a vault.
Yeah, so you're basically telling the buyer you're on standby. We're not going to necessarily open escrow until they cancel or don't perform. Okay, because if they do perform, you're not going to be able to open escrow on this one. You have to wait and give them the time necessary. So if they wait till the second day at 11:59 p.m. to give you the release of the contingency, you're basically stuck with this one. then you have to tell them, unfortunately, the buyer did perform and release this COP. Therefore, we can put you as a backup, or you can go find another property.
The most important thing in negotiating with buyer number two, when you're that listing agent, is to make sure you have the language of is subject to cancellation of existing escrow.
Yes,
Because without that language, you've now committed your seller of accepting a second buyer on the one property for sale.
that's right. That's right. Thanks.
Subject to cancellation with them?
Of existing escrow.
All right, so the next section is the time given notice, right? So immediately right to notify the buyer anytime after acceptance, right? That's one. Number two, if I'm the buyer that has this COP in place, right? I'm gonna say that no, I want to delay the right to notify my client that you have another offer. Because if you leave this blank, folks, I go into escrow, and then the listing agent gets an offer that same day, they can send us the notice to perform. Well, wait a minute, we just opened escrow yesterday. I get it. But that's where it says the immediate right to notify the buyer. So in order for you to protect your client from that happening, you're going to go to section number 2, delay right to notify. That gives the buyer 17 days or whatever you put. You may say 20 days. And here's where the listing agents sometimes don't see this. And now you're kind of screwed. Pardon my language. Remove that from the class. But you're basically putting your client in a good position, because now we have to give at least a minimum of 20 calendar days to release this COP. Meaning that if you get an offer, I'm good for 20 days. I don't care if you have another offer. You cannot invoke the right for me to force me the notice to perform because I have 17 days or 20 days. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a protection on the buyer who submitted a contingent offer to a listing agent, right? That's what we have. Now, the worst one is number 3, okay? If number 3 is checked, you're really, you know what I'm saying. Okay, the right to notify the buyer seller shall not have the right to invoke the provision on paragraph 7B during the entire term of the agreement. Okay, so if the agreement is 30 days or 45 days, you're protected until the deal basically closes because you check this. So yes, so be very careful, because a lot of agents may put that little X there, and if it's accepted by the seller, you're basically stuck until they sell their property. Or if they cannot perform on another condition, right, then you can cancel on this. But this specific COP will not be able because they check number 3. Okay, questions on that?
That's a good tricky place to put it because it's exactly on the bottom of the page.
That's right.
But
And
if
you sometimes, that's why I do this. I go through it like this. Removal of contingency. The contingency can only be removed in writing, obviously. Just because it says here, it still has to be contingent removal, right? The CR form / buyer. So buyer has to send you the contingency removal, okay? Even if the buyer removes the contingency unless buyer. So even though this is already in place, they still have to send you the CR of removal of the COP. And on the CR, it does have a check mark that says that the buyer has released the COP as part of their condition. Okay, and seller has the right to cancel under paragraph 9, right? All right, and then the rest of the stuff is basically seller's right to cancel. Seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follow: after first giving the buyer notice to perform, which we already talked about. After first giving the buyer notice to perform, if buyer fails to close for the sale of the buyer's property within the time specified in the agreement. So it goes through kind of already what we discussed, right? Buyer right to cancel. Buyer can cancel the agreement in writing prior to buyer removal of the buyer's property contingency. If 1A or 1B applies, buyer is unable to enter into contract. So if we cannot get into escrow, then, you know, the buyer also is in a position that they could cancel too. Look, we tried, we couldn't get our property in escrow. We couldn't get an offer, or the deal fell out of escrow, we're gonna now send a cancellation. So it's a mutual thing. Both the buyer and the seller can release one another.
This one is safe in this case.
Yes, if you didn't release the COP and you're canceling because the COP, then yes, buyer has the right to their full deposit back. Other than any escrow, sometimes some escrow companies charge a minimal fee, but usually they're good in returning most, if not all, of your deposit. Contract obligation and deposit, it just goes into, that it says that if it is a contingent, that they don't necessarily have to put the money immediately, but if they're in escrow, then yes, they have to put the money immediately into escrow. All right, and then just a notice to remove a condition. Any questions regarding this particular form?
Can I bring up one other?
Yeah, absolutely.
The, on the first page of the COP under backup, you're the listing agent, your seller accepted an offer. 5 days later, another offer came through, okay, your seller now issues out the notice to perform to remove that sale contingency. One of the things though, and so that buyer may love that property so much that they are willing to remove that contingency. However, that buyer still is not in a financial position to be able to close the escrow on that purchase of your listing if in the event they are unable to sell and close escrow on the sale of their property. But yet you as the listing agent now have a potential backup offer. So one of the things that I write in the notice to perform is buyer, if in the event buyer is removing that sale contingency, buyer needs to be able to prove they have the ability to complete purchase, being able to document, I forgot my exact language, to be able to provide proof of funds of where the funds will be coming from. If in the event, okay, because we're now going on the basis of you're removing the sale contingent. If I'm the listing agent representing my seller, we're going to go on the basis of, will this buyer be able to perform of closing the escrow on their purchase if in the event they are unable to complete the sale on their home, even though they've removed the contingency? Because my job is not just for them to forfeit their deposit to my seller. My job is to get my seller's home sold. Okay, not just only put an extra 20 grand in their pocket and waste their time. Okay, so that's another layer that I end up doing that, maybe want to consider of, do they have that ability under worst case scenario? They remove their sale contingency, but can they actually perform all the way to the close of escrow?
That's right. All right, real quick, because I do have ALC in less than 30 minutes. Really quick, the seller purchase of replacement property. So this form is no different than the COP. It's just kind of the reverse. We talked about the buyer protecting themselves from obligating themselves into two properties, right? Their current home that they need to sell, and then their new purchase, right, that they want to buy, but it's a condition. This is the reverse. So this one is the seller purchase of a replacement property. So now this one says that if I'm the seller, right, I'm going to put this as a condition on my part that, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if I cannot find and identify and negotiate and open escrow and close, I'm not obligated to sell my property to you. So this form is given to the buyer when you do decide to put the property on the market. Okay, so it is a disclaimer and telling the buyer, look, I'll sell it to you, but it's on the ability that I can find a replacement property close concurrently, then I can sell it to you. But if I cannot find a property, then therefore I have the right to cancel. That's all it really is. Okay, and it's kind of similar to the COP. It's very comprehensive understanding and how to protect, right? So I'll go real quick through the motions of it, but it's similar to the COP. Just think of it, you're the buyer or you're the seller. Okay, if you're the buyer that needs the proceeds to buy a purchase property, okay, then it's a protection that if they cannot sell their home, they don't have the if they cannot sell their home, then they have the ability to back out of the deal. On the reverse, this SPRP form basically says, I'll put the property for sale. You want to buy it, I'll sell it to you. But if I cannot find and identify or my deal cancels, I have the right, as long as I keep this as a condition, because this is a contingency like the COP, and this is a 17-day contingency as well. So it establishes again the timelines, the finding of a replacement property, the protection of the seller from being homeless. Basically, I'm selling it, but I don't want to be homeless because I haven't been able to find a property. And what if you have a buyer that is a cash buyer, says I can close in 15 days? Yeah, I love that, right? Because I want the ability to have the means, but I also want the ability to find a home that I like, because I don't want to be out and I have to now move in with family, or even rent a place, a temporary place, or even a hotel until we close on my next replacement property, right? So this form basically gives you that layer of protection in case you do have to back out of the deal, right? So again, it's kind of the similar scenarios of the replacement property, finding a replacement property, 17 days, right? And that buyer who is ultimately in escrow with you, and this is a replacement, that buyer does not have to do any physical inspections, any appraisal. They don't even have to put the earnest deposit until you now identify an open escrow. The minute that you open escrow, then the buyer has to do their due diligence in order to do so, because you may need the proceeds again from the sale of this home to be able to purchase their upleg, right? So you may have a replacement property, and then you may have a COP too that protects you from both the back end and also the front end. So you may have a COP and also the seller the SRPR form as well. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into it because it's kind of similar. I encourage you to please look at the form. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But it goes through some of the elements again of the timelines and deposit. And I'll make sure to get this all out to everyone. I'll send out an email so that way you have both the presentations and is a guide that will help you also kind of navigate this as well. Contingency period, standard inspections contingency period typically begins when the purchase agreement is executed, but the SPRP certain deadlines may be delayed. Seller finding a property, right? Seller must meet the deadline to find and contract for replacement property. Commonly 17 days, must provide written proof of the buyer, right? And then the final notice and all of the stuff. The critical timelines, right? Again, this is a 17 days, but you can also be less or more as well, right? Depending on the condition that you're currently in. Again, like on the CLP, communication is vital, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts to this. Notifications immediately, if something changes, you got to let everyone know within that 2-day period. Sorry about that. Okay, contingency removal process, the deadlines, right? Seller's decision points, a written removal. Remember, this is again part of the condition. Once the seller releases this contingency, they cannot use this as an avenue to back out if their upleg doesn't happen, right? And the deal cancels, then you're unfortunately out. You have to now sell it as a regular sale. And if the deal is 30 days, you have to pack and leave, because now the buyer has the right to says, no, you release this as a condition. I'm sorry that you're not able to close on your deal or find the replacement. But the minute that you release this condition, you told us that we're moving forward. And I've already started my process. I already did what I needed to do. And I already gave notice to my place where I'm currently living. So they cannot use this as a condition to back out. So unfortunately, the seller would have to be forced to sell. Okay. But this is why they have this protection in place to protect the seller. And then again, the buyer's right to cancel. So again, if the seller cannot find and identify a property, again, just kind of the similar to the seller, the buyer says, look, I don't want to drag for weeks and weeks and weeks or months. I also want to go and buy a place. I don't want to be here with this particular escrow. Then you have that provision in place that allows you to back out and then cancel and then go find another property that is not contingent that the seller has to find a replacement property. Okay. And the seller rights to cancel and financial obligations, right? So when the seller can cancel, right? So if the seller cannot perform, meaning they cannot find a replacement property, and let the buyer and the buyer agent know, look, I tried to find something, I couldn't make it happen. Unfortunately, I'm using the right now to cancel. And if they still have this as a condition, then the seller has the right to cancel because this was a provisional condition that said to the buyer, full transparency, look, I'll sell it to you, but I'm also telling you if I cannot find something that I like, I don't have to sell the property. And that's their exit. Okay. And then consideration from agents advising the seller, right? Help sellers understand that while this addendum protects them, it may make their property less attractive too. Yeah, no difference is like when a COP comes in, it's not an attractive offer because it's uncertain if they're going to be able to close. So if I have other offers, I might put the COP, even if it's um, higher price, better terms, you got to weigh it out, right? At the end of the day, it still is a stipulation. And if they can't sell all of the good terms, doesn't mean anything because they're not able to close on the deal, right? So you got to look at it from that perspective. Advising the buyer clearly explain the uncertainty too, right? If we accept this, please understand, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, that we're in the mercy of the seller fighting, identifying, negotiating, open escrow, and hopefully successfully close. If we keep this contingent, they can at the last minute cancel on us as well. Okay. Obviously, you want to negotiate to make sure that it's fair for both, right? Because it cannot be just one-sided. It has to be a win for all parties, right? And then obviously the bigger picture, just managing the time as well to make sure that we're within the timelines necessary because we don't want to go months and months and months and months and months, right? And then the last part of it is just some takeaways, right? Balance protection, everything must be in writing, understand the financial obligations, consideration, communications, and then obviously understanding the timelines. All right. With that being said, that kind of wraps it up. Any questions regarding the COP?
Basically, communication is the essence of.
Exactly. So,
Thank you very much.
all right, guys. Well, that concludes. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I will see you on the next contract class. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks,
Thank you,
Simon.
Simon.
Thank you.
Simon, thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
What's the next second?